where we've talked a little bit about involving local community and training individuals to handle this. It's great if you get a big chunk of money from the JEF or from another government or some organization, but that's a chunk of money that might last you 5 years. So if your whole program is built on expensive imported consultants, you may find yourself in a bind when that money runs out. And so it's interesting to me that Guyana specifically kept in mind capacity building and long-term sustainability. The best, most robust monitoring system in the world isn't very useful if you cannot continue to implement it and to maintain it.
What does tier 1, tier 2, tier 3?
That's straight out of the IPCC guidance, and they have tier levels. And so for some countries, if you're a tier 1 nation and you have no inventory data, you don't have the capacity to acquire it, there are all sorts of default values. And so you can report to the Framework Convention using those default values. And you can use different tiers for different pools. So if you have no soil information in your country, you might be tier 1 for soil. But if you have some forest overstory data, you might be tier 2 there. So you always want to use the highest tier that you can. And they're all spelled out. There's a decision chart in the IPCC guidance. And so you strive for the highest tier. And in the United States, a lot of times we are at tier 3. But most countries are a mixture of tiers, and it just depends on the capacity in that individual area. And you could see that in Guyana, they were striving in those demonstration areas to reach a higher tier. So the important bullet point on here, so they did have external inputs, and when you look at the report, you can see there were a lot of different data layers. There was Landsat data, they were given some spot data, which is a commercial French satellite, just all different sorts of data layers that were acquired and merged and used to just begin the process and start that baseline mapping, try to map out the forest areas and use them to plan the inventory on the ground. The important bullet point I think here is, once again, build capacity with local resources. There's a lot of inventory work to do. They are taking a very remote sensing-based approach, and part of the reason is their topography makes that a necessity, and it's also one of the easier ways to get started, just because you have that larger view. It gives you time to implement the inventory. They are really focused on building that capacity. So there's just a list of a lot of different activities. And again, this is sort of the more technical. It's not quite so important, but archive the existing data. That was one of the things she had mentioned was really important. They're also working hard on change detection and being able to monitor where there are changes in land use, and that's again an area where remote sensing is extremely helpful. And then working on that accuracy of the maps. So they are going out on the ground to assess those maps. And one of the things, if you look at the report on the flash drive, is that there's persistent cloud cover. And that's something, when we think about remote sensing, solving all of our problems, just as a function of where Guyana is located, they really have a problem with being able to get enough cloud-free days to get high-quality remote sensing data. So there's just another wrinkle when you're planning, another hurdle that you have to leap and you have to plan for. And one of the other things that she had mentioned when I had sort of asked some specific questions was that to give a lot of thought to drivers of deforestation and to build that into your planning and to help you know sort of where to focus your resources on monitoring, was that drivers was a really important thing to consider. And sometimes we get so hung up on measuring the boxes that we forget about some of these more process-related things. But again, red is about reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, so understanding those drivers can help us sort of focus better on maybe where to locate our projects, where to focus our monitoring efforts. So that's another key point I wanted to make. Using the stock difference method, as you can see. Baselines and reference levels are one of those tricky things. We've talked about it a little. I know in the coffee break some of us were talking about it. It is really challenging as to how to define those. Business as usual is often mentioned, but that may not be appropriate. They solved the problem with Kyoto by picking 1990 and using a base year instead of a baseline. But this is always for any project, regardless of the program, is this setting this baseline is always going to be a challenge, and it's going to require a lot of thought and discussion to get something that makes sense. And I think there isn't going to be one answer for this. It's really going to be country specific, and you can see, you want to look at historical emissions, but because Guyana is fortunate and has very low rates of deforestation, they've decided this may not be the appropriate reference scenario for them. So again, this is something, baselines are something that seem very straightforward, but when you think about it and you move to having to implement something, you realize there's just a lot of things to consider. And so that was one of the things she wanted to highlight for us. Barriers, this was one of my really key questions to her, because again, they were starting from scratch. They've got a challenging situation for field inventory, and they really didn't have the capacity. And so some of the barriers were just the understanding of all the nuts and bolts of how all this works. And then again, you're integrating across different organizations, you're working with different countries, different agencies, and so making all of that work, sort of building that communication, is definitely a challenge. And there was a lot of technical work. I mean, they're really just beginning the process, and so there's just an awful lot to be done. And this is all learning by doing for everyone. And so hopefully, as more and more countries move through the red readiness and move into implementation, can share their experiences and sort of help everybody figure out some of the more workable ways to do this. Again, there's not going to be just one answer. But learning by doing it, again, you can see her last appropriate system for Guyana. What might be a great system in the US, we've got our inventory down fairly well. But interior Alaska is a problem. We do not have inventory data for interior Alaska. You've got to drop folks in there by helicopter. And you actually have to have one person who stands there with a rifle, because frequently a bear will come along and want to eat you. This makes the average cost, I'm told, of one field plot. So normally our FIA plots in the US are on average $700 to measure. Some are more, some are less. That's at least $6,000 per plot in interior Alaska. So we don't have a lot of inventory data for that. And so it's a challenge even in the United States, and certainly every country is going to have areas that are just really difficult to access. Maybe the terrain is really steep and it's hard to get folks in there. Maybe the forest is really dense and it's hard to move through. You've got trees with stilted roots. There isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all answer. Every country will find its way. There will be common themes, but it's important that you just don't import a system from someplace else that may really not work for you on the ground. So these are the challenges and existing gaps. And a lot of it was, again, the capacity. They just didn't have the capacity. And you've got to link to all these other programs that are going on, and so that's something we're in the process of building all those links and working on that. We've got a lot of different stakeholders involved, and again, now we've got cloud cover, and then building in a national forest inventory. Most countries don't have them, and Guyana is one of them, so they're trying to incorporate that standard census or census into this whole system, and designing all of that from the ground up. Cloud cover, we mentioned, that's been an ongoing problem in the remote sensing component of it. And just, again, Red Plus is all in flux. There aren't a lot of hard and fast rules yet, so you're sort of putting the car together as you're driving down the road. And so the lessons learned, and I'll expand on this in a little bit, was, you probably have got some work going on that can be part of this process. But it's really important to involve all the stakeholders and to make sure that what you're working on is appropriate for your situation and your country. You really need to think sustainably, think down the road, build that capacity so that you can stand on your own in the future and be able to carry on the program. And it's important, there are a whole lot of international agreements going on and different programs, and so you do want to try to link to those to sort of leverage resources wherever you can. And the point she reiterated in her email to me was that even if you don't have full capacity, and you don't quite have all the outlines of the plan, that it's really important to go ahead and move ahead anyway and to begin the process rather than waiting for everything to be perfect and ready to go. And that part of this process is really setting your priorities and figuring out your implementation plans to how to best achieve that. And there's a lot of acronyms up here. A lot of these are remote sensing. You'll see the GOSC Gold source book is actually on your flash drive. That's a very remote sensing based approach, and that has been the approach Guyana has been taking to begin with. Geo, Linda mentioned about the Forest Carbon Tracking Task. Forest Carbon Partnership Facility is one of those funding mechanisms. There are also bilateral agreements, cross-border agreements with other countries. So there's just a lot of different players in the game, but there's a lot of experiences that can be shared and learned. So again, we see the theme of capacity building, national coordination, but again, you've got to work at the local levels because that's where those projects are going to happen, and build capacity along the way. A lot of technical challenges, so there's sort of learning by doing, and they've been working, I believe it's Finland that Guyana's been partnering with, and a lot of the funding has come from Finland. But then also trying to balance with their new low carbon development strategy, the development objective with the REDD+ efforts to try to make sure that everything works together. And that absolutely looks gorgeous. But I had asked Pradeepa to give me some feedback on some, just on a personal level, of her work in this process, what they had encountered. And so I said, well, what was the biggest capacity gap that you had? And she said, well, most of it was in the technical areas, such as remote sensing. And if you look at the report, you see they will work with a consulting firm who did a lot of that initial work. And I had asked her, what national data sets did you have? How did you find them? And she said, the main national data sets were available, but they weren't collated. They weren't pulled together and cross-linked in any way. So this REDD readiness work, they did create a framework for sharing the data sets, and they include mining areas, forest concession areas, other use such as agriculture, protected areas, infrastructure layers, and indigenous title lands. So there are quite a few indigenous peoples in Guyana. So you'll see if you look at the report on your flash drive that those are all mapped out. And so because of my conversations with another individual, I was really curious about these remote and inaccessible areas and how they proceeded with the mapping. So the mapping is in the MRV report. You can see the whole strategy with the remote sensing layers and that report on your flash drive. But I wanted to know about these really inaccessible areas and how they plan to solve the challenges. Because again, remote sensing is great, but you still need some of the ground data to make sure that what you've mapped is really what's on the ground. So what they have done was they did that substratification, and they designated the inaccessible areas a separate data layer. So they will think about those, think about the challenges in them, and go back and address those when they've come up with a plan. They didn't want to let those inaccessible areas get in the way of moving forward with the rest of the inventory. So I thought that was a really good point. And that was one of her main messages, was don't wait to get started, don't let the fact that you don't have a perfect system and all the data in place stop you from getting started on your journey. And so I had asked her, what advice she had for anyone here on how to move ahead when you didn't have the full technical capability and all of the data. And so I'm just going to read her reply. Our advice is that it's possible to start even if you have some data. We see the MRV process as a continuous stepwise approach that must be undertaken using a process of continuous improvement. Our approach uses an MRD capacity building roadmap that extends over a 3-year period. You acquire data as you progress and you build capacity as you move along the roadmap. Also, one should design the activities to allow for local capacity to be built, although consultancy support may be used, i.e. the consultants train locals to execute tasks. So we've mentioned that several times today. And the last thing that I thought would be useful for people here is I'd asked her what lessons learned and things to think about when planning for REDD+ projects or MRV in general. And I had mentioned drivers. Her reply is, from our experience, it is important to consider the drivers of forest change and the accompanying land use and the trend of this change. We've identified 5 main drivers of deforestation and 3 main drivers of forest degradation. We've monitored this from 1990 to present and continue to do so, making progressive improvements as we go along. To ensure we are on the right track, we seek independent reviews at strategic parts of the process. So I have just tried to, if we zoom out of this presentation, I I've just tried to summarize those, so that should be in your handout. So I can contact her if people have further questions. Again, they're just sort of beginning this process, and if you look at the report on the flash drive, it really looks like they've made a tremendous amount of progress from the time when I had first spoken with someone. They're still working out some issues, but I think there's a lot of good takeaways there from the experience in Guyana. I'm not sure I can answer any questions on there, but if someone has any, I would be happy to try. We're actually a little bit ahead of schedule, so I don't know, we can take a group poll, we can have an extra long lunch, or if people want to have some general discussion related to our class or related to inventory, we can kind of rearrange things into that. I don't want to move ahead, I think, into equations and things, because I think doing equations before lunch, that's kind of hard. Or not the most exciting.
Momentarily, if you don't mind, can I copy the presentation, the thumb drive? Or
I didn't get specific permission to distribute it. I didn't get a chance to double check. I didn't get a chance to double check with her. The MRV report is on there, but afterward, if I'll keep a list of things, and I'm sure it's fine, but I just want to have specific permission.
You have cooperated with a number of countries on this kind of work. Where do you find that it makes most sense to locate the activity? Well, the carbon is in the soil, which may be controlled by the Department of General Lands or whatever, or a Department of Agriculture. There's carbon in the trees, which is partly under a forest authority, and the trees outside the forest and agriculture. Where does it make sense to locate the central capacity for carbon tracking?
That is a really good question, and that's a tough one, and I think it's going to depend really on your individual situation, because in different countries, as you indicated, the authority may rest in different places. All of our reporting goes through the Environmental Protection Agency for the Framework Convention reporting, but certainly the Forest Service hands over, and Linda actually for many years has done the forest numbers. The agricultural lands are handled by another agency, and so but that's all coordinated. In terms of a project, are you talking more about a project level?
I'm talking about the system.
If you have a whole system, there should be one agency that is designated for reporting, meeting the Framework Convention, reporting obligations, and that's usually one agency, and it differs. A lot of times it is the Environmental Protection Agency or whatever that analogous ministry is, and then that agency or ministry has to coordinate with all the other different departments to generate the reporting. But there should be one agency designated to do the country level reporting, and then they would just have to handle the coordination among all the different sectors, because we have multiple agencies in the U.S., but they all do report back to the Environmental Protection Agency, who does the final report. And it can be quite a job. On a project level, that would all be, you would design the project and everyone on the project would work together. But nationally, you should have a point of contact designated, and then they have to coordinate.
It's not sure it's something you're going to cover or not, but fire, there's a damage that's done to a forest after a fire, and starting again, reaccounting for the forest after a fire event. How do you measure what carbon's still existing in the forest after a fire to then account for its sequestration after that?
That again would differ depending on the level. That's one section of the IPCC guidance I did not look up. but it is in there. That is, natural disasters and unanticipated losses are covered. There are emission factors tables that you can sort of use to estimate the emissions from fire. So usually you need to know the number of acres burned. I'm not sure how they handle things like large-scale insect disturbance. I did not check that section, but for fire it's usually activity data, so either numbers of acres burned and then there's some emission factors. If you were in a project context, that would actually most likely be directly measured. And some projects, funders will require additional acres to be added in sort of as an insurance policy, but that would be negotiated at that project level. But usually it's in acres times a factor. I'm not sure how specific, because of course there are a lot of different types of things that can go wrong. I'm not sure how specific the guidance is on that. But I believe in the last round of guidance you weren't really specifically sort of charged with that because it was a natural disaster. But that's one area I didn't double check.
Just as a further comment to the question, particularly wet tropical forest, calculating the area will is one thing, but the problem is in the forest, there are areas that are burned at different intensity, so you don't get that even burning right to say everything is completely destroyed and have 25% destruction and part.